morning. For more than a decade, the countries of the Atlantic Alliance, and we are still an alliance, have talked about improving their defense industrial bases. With Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, this has taken on new urgency. The United States released its first ever National Defense Industrial Strategy in January 2024. The European Union followed closely with the release of its first ever European Defense Industrial Strategy in March 2024, followed more recently, this past March, by the White Paper for European Defense Readiness 2030 and the Rearm Europe plan, which included the €150 billion Security Action for Europe, or SAFE instrument, meant to substantially increase investments in Europe's defense capabilities. And the United Kingdom, which released a Defense and Security Industrial Strategy in March 2021, will issue a new strategy building on its December 2024 Defense Industrial Strategy Statement of Intent. And now, even while we're meeting in Delphi, the White House has released an executive order on accelerating defense procurement and modernizing the defense acquisition workforce with a goal of incentivizing risk-taking and innovation from those personnel. Within 60 days, the Secretary of Defense is to hand the President a plan to reform the defense acquisition process. So the production of paper has been impressive. But what does this actually mean for strengthening and enlarging the Allied defense industrial base and making it more innovative and responsive to defense needs? The threats, if anything, appear to be mounting. And so the capacity to respond to them now and in the future is an urgent matter. We have a distinguished panel to discuss these issues today. Ruth Harris, Director of Defense and Security at RAND Europe, which works across EU countries and in the UK. Ruth is not only a top analyst and security leader, but is also a 25-year veteran of the Royal Air Force, having worked alongside US and European forces, and so one hopes is a satisfied customer of defense industries. Emanuele Serafini, Vice President for Western Europe, Lockheed Martin, has direct responsibility over the Nordics, Benelux, France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and notably Greece, and with previous experience in other defense companies. Ultimately, the success of all the plans that I mentioned will ride on the ability of industry to deliver. And I am Howard Shatz. I'm a senior economist at RAND in Washington, D.C., where I work on issues of economics and national security throughout the U.S. defense and security establishment, including our combatant commands, the Army, the Air Force, the Pentagon, and more. Ruth, let's start with you. One of the main challenges that the EU has faced is fragmentation of the defense industrial base. Why is this, and how does the UK, with its strong national defense industrial base, fit in?
Thanks, Howard, and thanks very much for having me here. So the European defense industrial base is basically a compromise between three potential structures, which is being truly European, being transatlantic, or being national. In economic and industrial terms, this is kind of suboptimal, I would say. But it does allow national governments to retain more control over companies and at times kind of more parochial industries, which it needs to do, and business interests. But the result really is that Europe offers a multitude of competing weapon systems within the same category. The industrial structure, broadly speaking, therefore, leads to an abundance of suppliers with limited production capabilities and a reliance on, in defense terms, rather kind of artisanal rather than industrial manufacturing. And then there's the elephant in the room, which is the United States as a weapon producer. For the European states, purchasing American systems, regardless of the political dimensions attached to this, is usually a trade-off. You increase your short-term readiness, but at the cost of likely sacrificing long-term innovation. And I am speaking broadly here. For the UK, though, it's slightly different, particularly the relationship with the US. So for the last 20 or 30 years, from a capability planning process, the UK has tried to be like a mini US, if you like, and do a little of everything, with high-end capability, particularly. But of course, this has pros and cons, and the UK has really neglected some areas, such as land-based platforms. But the approach to procurement with the US is to buy into programs with US manufacturers. And that has happened to a degree elsewhere in Europe. But F-35 is a good example where the UK has 15% of the program embedded within British aerospace. This kind of also diversifies the portfolio over the years. And the UK has also gone in with Europe on Typhoon and Tornado, if we stick with the fast jet example. This approach has helped the UK turn on some really innovative and outward-facing stuff like GCAP and the AUKUS-related capabilities. But in terms of implications for the EU, I think we should distinguish here between platforms, so tanks, ships, aircraft, commodities, which artillery, missiles, ammunition, and critical technology, which I would say sort of AI and satellites, for example. The EU is very far from producing a platform from its member states, and I would argue this is absolutely not its role. We have no idea. We also have no idea, rather, what role other than regulation it would play on things like critical tech, for example, in AI and military use of AI. I think the EU's main added value, therefore, is in shaping the market incentives for military commodities such as ammunition. The EU will likely have its own never likely have its own arsenal, but through EU-wide financial incentives that come with strings attached in terms of standardization particularly, it can drastically shape production incentives and standards in the EU. Also, it can shape incentives for producers outside the EU who desire access to EU markets. Going back to the UK, in terms of comparison, the closest EU country model is probably the French, in that they buy far less US equipment, and it's all about developing the national industrial base. Sweden is also an interesting case if we look back over the years, and the development of the Saab Gripen, where they developed a combat platform that was not exquisite. I would say it was like 70% of what Sweden itself actually needed. But this enabled them to sell to countries like, for example, Brazil, and put the money back into Saab to develop a better aircraft for their own use. So what I'm saying really is there are models within models in Europe, so we should be careful not to generalize. Now, in short, she says, probably generalizing, the European context continues to operate as a panoply of small sovereign industrial bases, and therefore to generate duplicative capability. This undermines the ability to capture economies of scale, inhibits external export markets, and leads to a tendency to go and buy off the shelf from the US, despite the strategic risks I've mentioned, because of cost, quality, and time. The UK, however, collaborates internationally, buys nationally and internationally. So that, how it kind of lays out what distinguishes the EU and the UK industrial bases. What I'm interested in, though, is what distinguishes the US industrial base, and what are the challenges with that?
Good. Thanks, Ruth. Well, you mentioned scale, right? And I think for the US industrial base, scale is one of the biggest differences. It's the largest by far, so I'll give some examples. The top 5 US defense contractors are among the top 6 in the world, right? And they receive, right now they're receiving about 30% of Pentagon obligations, and I'll get to that dollar amount soon. So we have very large companies operating, and beneath them are subcontractors, sub-subcontractors. It's a very large sector, right? If we look at scale, then, we have to look at equipment purchases. So I'll go UK, EU, US. In 2023, 2024, UK equipment purchases, I'll use dollar terms just because we have pounds, euros, and dollars, so I'll make everything equal. In the UK, we had equipment purchases of around $25 billion, right? The EU in 2024 defense procurement was somewhere around $100 billion, right? In contrast, for fiscal year 2024, so the year ending September 30th, 2024, US defense procurement was estimated at $170 billion, so more than the UK and the EU combined. And then you add to that another $145 billion for research, development, test, and evaluation. I haven't given you the dollar figures for European or UK research and development, but they're far below what the US is doing. So we do have enormous scale, and that means larger production lines, more production, more innovation. There are some challenges, though, and I think these challenges are not unique to the US. I think defense industries throughout the alliance are looking at these same challenges, at least some of them. One is an aging workforce. So a lot of the specialists, a lot of the skills, people are in their 40s, 50s, and it's become difficult to get younger people to join these industries. Unique, perhaps, to the United States, we have difficult federal budgeting cycles. So you can read the news, you see we're operating on what's called a continuing resolution. We don't have a budget for this year. That has implications for defense purchases. Our physical plant, the infrastructure is aging a bit, and so that needs to be renewed. We have, as is well known, and this is not unique to the United States, supply chain vulnerabilities. To be very concrete, we don't have a good idea which components exactly might come from China or from other potential adversaries. And we do know that we are getting components from China. And then our own procurement processes are difficult. And so that relates to the executive order that I mentioned at the very beginning. Now, there's one other notable fact about the US defense industrial base. We consider foreign industrial bases to be part of our defense industrial base. So for purposes of the US Defense Production Act, a domestic source is defined as including Australia, Canada, and the UK. We also, in our section of our federal laws that cover defense, we have something called the National Technology and Industrial Base. That includes those same countries plus New Zealand. So it's a multinational defense industrial base. It's a very large defense industrial base. And that's one reason, just because of the scale, that the Allies will likely to continue to depend on the United States. Now, Ruth and I come from the policy community. And I want to stay on industry here, because ultimately transatlantic success at meeting the defense industrial base goals that all of these countries and entities are talking about will depend on the defense companies themselves. Emanuele, you come from one of the top 5 prime contractors that I mentioned, and you'll play a foundational role in industrial base modernization and expansion, not just in the US, but across the alliance. All of the different poles of the alliance have their own goals, however. So let's stay on Europe, because we're in Europe. What challenges will the recent boost of EU strategic autonomy pose to non-EU companies, such as Lockheed Martin?
Well, thank you, Howard, for the question. But first, let me thank Rand and the Delphi Economic Forum for inviting me to speak at such an important event. Coming back to your question, yes, it does present some challenges, but also some opportunities, and let me explain. As I said, the publication, as was mentioned, of the EDIP and EDIS, the recent white paper with $800 billion plan EU investment, the publication, the release of the SAFE $150 billion mechanism, and all this in about 12 months, is relevant for companies like Lockheed Martin, and actually proves that the EU is pretty serious in their endeavor to develop their own capabilities, sovereign capabilities, and aim actually to reducing the dependencies from non-EU, let's say, not EU companies, and specifically from the US. Another question, which was already mentioned, is actually how long it's going to take for Europe to deliver those capabilities. And I think we all agree it's not going to happen in the short terms. And Ruth mentioned about the fragmentation of the European industry, and I will add also if still national interests prevail in the decision-making process. However, regardless of the timeline, I think we also, everybody agrees to the fact that the European Union knows how to build a single market. And this is their aim when we talk about defense. But let's actually remind ourselves what are the EU targets in this case. As we mentioned, reduce dependency, how they want to do that, incentivized by European and developing EU alternatives, increase actually intra-EU coordination and collaboration through aggregate demand and incentivized joint procurement, establish a single market through the regulatory system and financial and fiscal incentives. What all this means for a company like Lockheed Martin, who is not a European company. First of all, a limitation to access the market. Because if in a single market you put entry barriers on one side and you incentivize, let's say, I don't want to call the word subsidize, but incentivize the companies that are operating within that market, then it's difficult to enter first, but also you are less competitive. The second one, you are creating additional, let's say, you're creating new competitors. And there is also a distortion, if I can, about the competition itself, because those countries that will contribute to develop those capabilities, then they will be also committed to buy this capability, regardless whether in terms of quality or in terms of cost, this capability is competitive or not with what there is, let's say, in the market. And this is just to operate in the market. If then you want to actually be eligible to and access those funds that are available, we see what are the requirements in the SAFE mechanism. We are talking about 65% of European content. We are talking about design authority based in the UAE, in the EU, sorry. You need to adhere to EU government's rules. And of course, your facilities and infrastructures need to be placed in Europe. So what does it mean for a company like Lockheed Martin? For a company like Lockheed Martin, it is, if we don't react and adapt fast, we will be strongly penalized. And the option really is, do you want to become part of the European defense ecosystem, or do you want to stay and remain as a niche supplier for maybe very advanced capabilities that Europe will not be able to develop or decides not to develop? I think for a company like Lockheed Martin, for the fact that we've been, let's say, operating in Europe for 70, 80 years, a lot of our systems are in service, are operational. A lot of our system will be in service soon. Really, there is not an option. The option is to stay in Europe and to be part of this European ecosystem. We will support and provide our partners and customers with the best kit for the next 50 years and 60 years. So what does this require for a company like us with what is happening? I think a mindset shift. We need to be less transactional and more strategic. Why I'm saying that? Because we have, let's say, an incredible and very extensive network of partnerships in Europe. We have a relationship and we partner with most of the national defense champions. But these partnerships are driven by programs. So it's the programs who drive the partnership. And this is a very transactional approach. We need to turn it in a more strategic one, where actually it's the partnership itself who produce, through innovation, who deliver capabilities that will actually, support yourself to win more programs into the market and be more competitive. And are we there yet? Yes, we are working on that. There is actually a strong push, and which involves also, think of co-production, co-development in Europe. We are ready to do that. We are working to this direction. We need to follow also very carefully what you said before about this, how the new administration will remodel it and we streamline a little bit the FMS process, because, as I said, those partnerships involve the US supply chain and will sustain also US jobs.
So it sounds like you're facing a more competitive landscape, especially as Europe supports its own companies. But part of the answer is to think more strategically, to be more intertwined. Let me continue with you, and let's look inside the company a little bit. So I had mentioned innovation when I talked about the US defense sector. Defense has always been a high technology industry. It's quite remarkable what gets produced. And the need has never been greater now for new and better warfighting technologies. In the current European environment, and let's stay with Europe, how does the need to build national effective deterrence translate into industrial and technology priorities for a company such as Lockheed Martin?
Well, Howard, let's start that traditionally, deterrence has always been built using a mix of diplomacy, economic, and military power. Unfortunately, the war in Ukraine has proved that diplomacy has failed so far. Economic sanctions didn't really discourage Russian action. So over the past 3 years, it became actually clear that the military superiority is nowadays the base of deterrence. And actually, Lockheed Martin priority is to provide our partners and allies with cutting-edge deterrence and security solutions, which have been delivered to Greece for more than 70 years now. And we do this by developing and offering next-gen combat-proven capabilities to grant this military superiority. So our systems have been proved quite effective in the field and represent the state-of-the-art technology. And this is actually the direction that also Greece is taking on its way forward, because if you see the Prime Minister presentation to Parliament, the recent one on the 12 years defense plan, he actually mentioned those state-of-the-art capabilities. He mentioned the F-35, and also he seems that technology, in order to sustain and to upgrade the current capabilities in service, is also the focus of this effort. In terms of advanced capability, just to give you an example, I would like to talk a little bit about the F-35, because at the moment is one of those capabilities that has been quite successfully sold in Europe, and Greece as well have procured. Now there are, I think, 12 countries in Europe that have acquired this system, and I call it a system because it's perceived as a very advanced jet, but actually it's a key enabler for multi-domain operation because of his capacity to collect, to fuse, and to transfer an incredible amount of data. So for all the operators, what is now the next step? The next step is actually to connect this asset to their military capabilities in operation, and to connect it also with allies and friends, so to create this interoperability. And this is actually will allow in real time to operate in this multi-domain environment. We have developed our solution, which is called 5G MIL connectivity, which is actually uses technologies from commercial available solution. We have partners like Intel, Verizon, Microsoft. And if you think with more than 635s operating in Europe by 2030, so in 5 years, being able to interconnect and operate as a force multiplier will be the centerpiece of the European and Greek deterrence. Another key element of deterrence in which we are deeply involved is the availability and the readiness of those systems that we are selling. And, also the capacity to operate for a prolonged time in the case of conflict. So sustainment and logistics become paramount in this framework. I just want to mention a couple of the technologies that we have developed around that. The first one, in terms of sustainment, is predictive analytics, which utilize machine learning algorithms to forecast demand for supplies, anticipate equipment failures, and predict operational tempo. The interesting part is these algorithms and data originate from the sensors on the aircraft that are transferred to a digital twin who has been created during the development and the production of the platform itself. So you have in real time always the status of the platform, the aircraft, once in operation. The second one that we are using for logistics are autonomous and unmanned systems. So, and this is these are systems that we've been using mainly for, resupply or reconnaissance, also for maintenance. In terms of autonomous system, for instance, we have developed Matrix. Matrix is something that you can, is a system that you can fix inside a Black Hawk helicopter, and then you can pilot it remotely for certain kind of operations. And manned system, we're talking not only drones, but also vehicles that are completely autonomous. A third element, which is very important nowadays, and is a very strong requirement in Europe, is to localize national or regional sustainment centers and training. This is a key part because supports sovereign operational autonomy and actually answer also the strong requirement of security of supply.
Great. Thanks. Well, all these innovations are going to cost money. Ruth, I want to ask you. So we have some investment challenges in both the UK and the EU. Brussels and London are realizing now that they might be stronger together. So how should the European preference in defense spending include the EU? Are there discussions about that? And let me build on that. We know that creating new technologies and scaling up defense production will depend on a robust public sector expenditures and private sector investment. The private sector side is especially important when the defense companies are private and listed on equity exchanges, competing with other sectors for scarce capital. How might we be able to encourage investment in the defense sector by the public sectors and the private sectors in the UK and Europe?
Yeah, thanks, Howard. It's a great question. I've got a really good list here of barriers to integration between the EU and the UK, but actually I'm not sure it's helpful. And you could probably all guess them anyway. What the list really boils down to is there is a trilemma, lovely made-up word, but a trilemma for European countries. And that is, 1, between independence, 2, manageable costs, and 3, the financial spin-offs. And it's hard to maximize the strategic element, which is the independence, and the economic elements, the spin-off, and the costs at the same time. And this is because different countries prioritize different aspects at different times. So it means you don't get a convergence of focus on what people want to do. And this can be really challenging because then there's no convergence of action. I think it's also true to say that the UK is still slightly paralysed by the sort of pre-Brexit era narrative about the EU, and this really slows down potential collaboration and cooperation opportunities. And some of them that is very real, and some of it is still just cognitive. So the new EU white paper that both Howard and Emanuele mentioned, I won't go into in detail, but I think it shows, and we have examples from the past of where there's been really good cooperation. And I think A400M is a really solid example, but also in ammunitions and what Rheinmetall is doing in that area. The problem is that it just doesn't happen enough. And the states logically want to retain control. But right now, you see the narrative, and it's pleasing, though the reasons for it aren't, that they know they can't retain control because the barriers are getting in the way of what is really most important. Because despite all the barriers, the most important thing is the strategic imperative before us right now. And it has been before us for some time. And it's necessarily underlined for the EU and UK by the rhetoric and uncertainty that's coming out of the US. To get more cooperation in production, there needs to be impetus in the market in which the strategy is now investing. There also needs to be measures which address market fragmentation and collaborative production models, which we've already talked about a little. And more direct innovation from governments. And governments need to be clear about what their strategic priorities are and what they want defence to invest in. And that's something that defence has been asking about for a long time. What seems certain, I think, is with this uptick in defence spending, that there will be more scrutiny on defence spending, and that's something that defence isn't actually used to. Now, I'm quickly going to mention about public and private sector and how it acts. And for me, there's an overriding issue here, and that is thinking about defence as an ethical investment, which hasn't happened. It's about understanding the value of defence, and it goes to questions of resilience and therefore deterrence, which is linked to rearmament. And we need to use that word, rearmament, and not couch it in softer terms, because that is actually what it is. And the social contract we have with people. So after a long period of expeditionary and domestic sort of security focused defence spending, the landscape, as highlighted by Ukraine, is changing, and it's shifting towards more external security concerns. And the calculus of what constitutes an ethical investment is therefore changing. This kind of needs to be paired, I think, with a new approach to societal resilience, linked to a focus on one of the most significant undermining factors in European defence industrial base right now, and that is the growing and critical skills capability gap. And that's happening all over Europe and in the UK. Now, Rand's done a whole load of work on the value of defence, but what needs to happen now really is a PR campaign that reaches out to people through a range of means and clearly outlining how defence contributes to national value and the industrial base. And this has a critical role in supporting military and developing our defence tasks. The debate goes hand in hand with something we see increasingly now about national discussions across Europe around resilience and national service. And we've seen that debate in the Netherlands and an action happening there and in Belgium just this week. We understand, therefore, that the risk to our nation and what our individual roles are in that and our society and collectively within Europe, and that absolutely in this case includes the UK. So, Howard, the United States has set out ambitious goals for defence industrial base expansion. Quickly, I know, but what's it going to do to achieve them?
It's fine. So budgeting reform, acquisition reform, hopefully these will succeed. And Emanuele had mentioned autonomy. I want to set what the goals are, and you had mentioned innovation. I want to talk about 3 programs in brief, and you'll see a sense of where we're going with this. One is the Replicator Initiative, which is to produce autonomous vehicles that can be attrited, that can be destroyed, right? We don't care. They do their job, they can be destroyed. Those are being produced right now. The second is a concept. Of course, it's defense, so you have to have a cool name. Hellscape. So Hellscape envisions tens of thousands of unmanned ships, aircraft, submarines in the Taiwan Strait. And finally, we have another concept which is being developed called cats and kittens, LCATs, low-cost attritable aircraft technology, very large autonomous vehicles, kittens, very small autonomous vehicles, again, crowding the skies. So there's a huge move towards autonomy and very high-tech equipment. And these things are all being done now through innovation units. We're a bit out of time. I want to let Emanuele, if he wants, have the final word on how industry, what the challenges it faces are to meet all of these increased demands, and whether there are some easy solutions.
Well, actually, these solutions are actually the challenge. Is in this to try to cope the demand. I mean, the increased demand that has been caused by the Ukrainian war, not only by the fighting itself, but also by the countries that have supported Ukraine, is something that hasn't been unprecedented. So we, as Lockheed Martin, have ramped up our production considerably. Is this enough? Not, because we are facing challenges very quickly. You mentioned some of them, like a workforce. It's very difficult to find a skilled workforce nowadays. So in order to ramp up, we have to move people from one program to another one, which is not ideal. The second one seems to be easy, is actually to increase our production facilities. I mean, this is okay when you have a capacity in the current ones. But to build a new production facility, to build ammunition or missiles is not straightforward. I'm just thinking about the idea in Europe to use dismiss automotive production lines. I mean, are you going to buy ammunition in a very dense populated area, maybe in the outskirts or in the industrial park? No, you're not going to do that. So that one is another. Then the supply chain. Supply chain is a big issue. And also, I mean, very, very quickly, the availability of critical raw material and components. I mean, the trade war that is going on is not really helping, not only because of the cost, but also because in terms of retaliation, you have export limits. So they have export restrictions, and this doesn't help. So all these things combined, in a nutshell, means that it's quite difficult and is a big challenge.
I think to sum, what we're looking at are very ambitious plans that will take many years to unfold, and so perhaps we'll be able to do a temperature check at future forums to see how well we're doing. basically to create much better means of deterrence to prevent wars. Thank you.
Thank you.